But first, let's get into Ohio State. Okay, so the Buckeyes. This Buckeyes team, as you know, I've thought a lot of during the course of this season. And what you've heard me say for really the majority of the time is they're complete. They are balanced. Those are some of the words that I've used. I've used dominant. And granted, like, you should be dominant if you're them and you're that good and you're playing the schedule that they have. 100% agree with you. Those of you that said, who have they played? One, I think it's the most tired argument in all of like college football argument, but it is a weak schedule up to this point. There's no doubt about it. But let's break it down and let's take a closer look about what Ohio State actually is. Because I think this Ohio State team in 2022 is better than they were a year ago. And really might be their best team since 2019 and might even be better than the 2019 team. So let's dig into it because each area of this team, I think it stands out in their own unique way. Let's start with the offense. I think that their offense, as you've heard me say, is the best offense in college football. Now, there are some that have rivaled that, and certainly Tennessee is going to get their due. And trust me, I'll talk about Tennessee a little bit in here as well. But when you really look and you dig down and you start watching and preparing for this Ohio State team, what you'll realize is that this offense is probably better than a year ago, and they were clearly the best offense in college football a year ago. Let's look at their wide receiver position first. Now, how many teams in the country can lose 2 first-round wide receivers and then their best receiver who's coming back and the clear Biletnikoff front runner or favorite, if you will, for this season, best wide receiver in the country, Jackson Smith-Njigba, has basically been out the entire year. You would think that like, oh man, they probably are just trying to piece it together on the outside. Remember, lose 2 first-rounders, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and lose Jackson Smith-Njigba to injury this year, you'd probably assume that their passing game was taking a back seat, that they would have to rely on other areas of their team, but they haven't had to do that. In fact, if you look at the 2 guys that are being replaced that are now in the National Football League, the 2 guys that replace them are actually doing a better job. Whoa, wild. Right? I know that's crazy to say, but when you look at Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, what they did through 6 games, 61 receptions, 1,040 yards, and 13 touchdowns. You look at Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison, they've got 66 catches, 1,191 yards, and 15 touchdowns. That's wild. I'm sorry, but that's just wild. And I understand that it's like, hey, numbers are... That is wild. These 2 guys, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, were great players. Great players. And they're proving that out, by the way, at the next level. And here we got these other 2 guys, like Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison, just step right in and take that torch and move it forward. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Not only the level of recruiting, but also the level of development in that room. And this leads me to a guy that I've praised online and want to praise here on the podcast, and that's the position coach of the wide receivers for the Buckeyes, Brian Hartline. I think Coach Hartline is the best position coach in all of college football. He's an excellent recruiter, but even more so than that, he's a wonderful developer of talent. And granted, they've got talented guys. And you could say like, well, of course, anybody would be a great coach, Joel, if you got those players. Yes, but if you actually go and you talk with Garrett Wilson or Chris Olave or Marvin Harrison, which I have, and Egbuka or Jackson Smith-Njigba, what you'll find out is that this guy, Coach Hartline, is an unbelievable teacher of the game and more specifically, the craft. I think that that's a big reason why they're so good at wide receiver, why these young players can step in and play so effectively, produce at such a high level. Granted, they're very talented. I don't want to take anything away, but this guy does an amazing, amazing job. One of the things that I talked with over the summertime with Jackson Smith-Njigba, we were here at Steve Clarkson's passing camp here in Los Angeles, and there was a bunch of guys out there. You know, Caleb Williams is out there, and C.J. Stroud, and the Utah quarterback Cameron Rising was out there, and I got to tell you, like, it was fun being around all these great college players, yes, but the best conversation I had wasn't actually with a quarterback. It was with Jackson Smith and Jigba. And the reason is because of the level of detail that he went into when explaining what Coach Hartline goes through in their position meetings. And he talked about the information that you are allowing the defense to see through your route running and through your body language. And he went into such detail, and I thought to myself, there are very few position coaches in America that can coach to that level of detail. And it was a fascinating conversation. I fully understand why they are great at wide receiver. Partly it's great talent, but also it's great development from their coach, Brian Hartline. So their wide receivers are actually a step up. And remember, this is without Smith and Jigba, who probably is going to be back at some point during the course of this stretch run. Okay, so what else about their team? Because it can't just be their wide receivers. We see them have great offense before, but they've also got very good balance on their offense. And I think that they're actually better and much more physical on their offensive line, which allows them to run the ball more effectively. Okay, so this offense is better than they were a year ago because they're more balanced. I think Stroud is a better player, more on that in a moment, but their run game is more physical. Last year, they were averaging about 5.5 yards per carry, which is good. I'm not saying that it's not, but they were a bit of a one-back offense. TreVeyon Henderson, if he wasn't in the game, they didn't have a lot going on. Now they've developed some depth in the backfield, and they're more physical up front, which allows them to run for more yards per carry. 6 yards per carry. That's fifth in the country. They're more physical, and they have more depth in the backfield. So now it's not just TreVeyon Henderson, but also Mayan Williams, who's come in and contributed a great deal to that run game. I talked about CJ Stroud, and I will further that here. He's much better now than he was in the first 6 starts that he had last year. Remember, they had a loss to Oregon last year. He wasn't great in the first half against Minnesota. He was missing high. There were shoulder issues. He sat for a game. They didn't know what they had. Now, his numbers were good. I believe he threw his first 6 starts, I want to say 22 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So it was good and it was productive, but it wasn't nearly as controlled and as efficient as what we're seeing this year. Remember, he's got 24 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, and he's barely touched the field in the fourth quarter this year. So they're better on offense. But that doesn't make them the best team in the country. I've seen great offenses before. We all have. In fact, we've seen some incredible offenses that have fallen short at Ohio State, at Oklahoma, amongst others. And so they were going to have to get better on the defensive side. And the reason that they're number one for me is not that they've taken a step forward with their offense, which was already dynamic and electric a year ago, best offense in the country. It's because of the 18 steps that they've taken forward with their defense. Their defense under new defensive coordinator Jim Knowles is so much better than they were a year ago. I don't know how dominant they are, but I know that they're better. And I knew that last year, and really stands the test of time over the last couple of decades, if you don't have a defense that can play in the top 30, top 25 in the country, then you're a team that's probably not a national title contender. Because we've only seen 2 teams since the BCS started that have won a national championship without a top 25 defense. Okay? It just doesn't happen. You have to have a generational player to go and do that. In particular at quarterback, which maybe Ohio State does, maybe Tennessee does. I'm not sure. But that was Cam Newton's Auburn team that did it, Joe Burrow's LSU team, and that defense wasn't terrible. I think they were in the 30s in terms of defensive statistics. But this defense has taken giant leaps and bounds of improvement from what they were a year ago. Last year, they were terrible. It's the reason that they lost to Oregon. They had to redo their schematics in the middle of the year. They had to replace defensive play callers. Now they go out and they get a new coordinator in Jim Knowles, and they're sitting here and it's like, hey, don't mention this to anybody, but this is a top 10 defense in all of the important categories. Not just top 25, not just top 30, not just top half of college football, top 10. Top 10 in scoring defense. Top 10 in total defense, passing defense, rushing defense, And more importantly, yards per play defense, top 10 in every one of those categories. I can't wait to see how it plays out as they face better offenses. And I know that's not necessarily the case this week against Iowa, but this is a defense that I could see helping them win a championship. So why is Ohio State number one in the country? Well, as I just laid out, they're much more balanced, both offensively and defensively. They've been dominant, and they certainly fit the bill of a team that can go win a shootout, get into a tough game, and win because they have the requisite offense to do that at the top end and the requisite defense to get in there and slug it out if they need to do that. So that's why Ohio State's number one. That's why Tennessee is not number one. Tennessee right now is a bit one-dimensional. Obviously, I went through their defensive statistics on Monday. You can go back and listen to that episode. Listen, 129th in pass defense is not going to cut it. They're much better against the run, and that should help them. But why would you bang your head against the wall running the football when you can throw the ball against the 129th ranked passing defense? In particular, if you're a team that has Marvin Harris and Harrison and Mecca Ibuka and potentially Jackson Smith and Jigba. So Tennessee's got to get better at least a little bit in their passing defense. Tennessee on the offensive side is also not nearly as balanced as what Ohio State is. Now, they both throw the ball incredibly well, and Hendon Hooker has been outstanding. And right now, he's certainly in that Heisman Trophy front-running position conversation with C.J. Stroud. Their wide receivers are tremendous. They can get a wide receiver back, and I understand that, just like Jackson Smith and Jigba from Ohio State. But if you look at their yards per carry, they're not anywhere near what Ohio State is. Ohio State 5th in yards per carry in the country at 6 yards per carry. Right now, Tennessee 46th in terms of yards per carry. So this offense for Ohio State is better than Tennessee because they go exactly toe-to-toe from a passing perspective, and they can run the ball. I think they're better at offensive line. Let's look back through history. Like, what does this offense remind us of? Well, you could say 2019 LSU. Okay, maybe they won't put up the passing statistics that Joe Burrow put up. I mean, he was close to 6,000 yards passing and 60 touchdowns. That was a remarkable year throwing the ball. They didn't run the ball like this team does. In fact, that 2019 LSU team, they were 31st in the country in yards per carry. Maybe it's the more balanced version of a great offense that we saw the very next year in 2020 when it was Alabama and they had Najee Harris and they had Devontae Smith and they had Mac Jones and a great offensive line and they could do it all. Maybe that's a better comparison for this Ohio State team. I will tell you, though, that this Ohio State team is a better team. And the main point is they can still get better with Jackson Smith and Jigba. That's scary. They're really good. They can go to a scary level. Those are the reasons why Ohio State is number one in the country for me right now. Now, we'll see how it plays out during the course of this stretch run. Listen, if Tennessee goes and beats Georgia in Athens, I will, mark my words, if Tennessee beats Georgia, they will be my number one team. There's no doubt about it. I have my questions whether they can do that or not because they're not as balanced. This is still a team in Tennessee that was outgained by Florida and Alabama. Both Florida and Alabama had more first downs than they did, even though Tennessee won both of those games. And this is still a team that went to overtime with Pitt when Pitt sat on the ball in the last minute with their backup quarterback hobbling around with a bum ankle. So, that's still in the bag as well, right? You think about a golfer, what's your worst shot possible? I think Tennessee's worst shot possible in their bag is probably lower. The floor is lower than what Ohio State's is right now. So Ohio State is going to be my number one team in the country, and we'll see them this week. I can't wait to see them. Last point on Ohio State. I've told you before, I can get a really good sense and a feeling about a team after covering them. I wish I could cover more SEC teams. It's just not in the cards. I really do. I wish I could be a part of those environments and get around those teams. I loved covering Alabama, went there in the spring and then covered them again for Texas earlier in the year. I got a much better sense about their team and their culture. I had a really good feeling about this Texas team after meeting with them in person before that Alabama game. And I think that that's coming to fruition as we see Quinn Ewers and his health. I had a great feeling last year about that Michigan team. I remember telling people about it, it just feels different. It feels special at Michigan. I felt the same way in 2019 about Ohio State. That was just a special group. So I can't wait to get around this Ohio State team and just to sense it, just to feel it. What's the leadership like? What's the locker room like? What's the coaching staff, like? What are their body language? All that stuff makes a difference, and I'll get to see it this week as Ohio State takes on Iowa. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoy that clip, make sure you click subscribe somewhere down here. From game highlights to exclusive interviews and rankings, we've got everything you need as a college football fan right here, College Football on Fox.